Okay, great. So good morning, everyone in Canada. I'm very impressed to hear about all the people spread out around North America and around the world who are in this talk. Today, I think we can talk about Myanmar 2020 election from a couple of points of view. We want to look at the election campaign, which was quite unusual, what election day in a pandemic was like. We can look at the results, the outcome, and then maybe we can speculate a little bit about what we can expect from Myanmar in 2021. So I know most of you, or many of you in the audience, know a lot about Myanmar, but just allow me to review a couple of facts about the electoral system very quickly, just so we don't get confused later on when we're talking about the different elections that were going on. So let me see. Okay, did that work?
Yes.
Okay, great. So just really quickly, Myanmar is divided into 14 subnational units, as you know, 7 states and 7 regions. And the names don't denote any difference in function, but just that the regions are areas that are populated mostly by the Bamar ethnic majority, and the states are mostly populated by minority ethnic groups, the largest of which in the state gives its name to the state. So Shan, Kaya, Kayin, Mon, Rakhine, Chin, Kachin. And these units are quite different in size, with the larger regions like Irrawaddy or Yangon being about 7 million people, while the smaller states like Chin and Kaya have about 1 million people each, under 1 million people each. Census data in Myanmar is still quite unreliable, but in general, we can say that the regions contain about 70% of the population, and the states maybe 30 or a little bit less than that. Those states and regions are further divided into townships, of which there are 330. And these are administrative divisions which originate in the British colonial era, and surprisingly few boundary changes have been made since independence. So why did I show you those 2 maps? Well, with those 2 maps in mind, you can construct the Myanmar electoral system, which looks a little bit more familiar to Americans than Canadians perhaps, but it's still quite different from both. We have a lower house. Now, I don't know if you can see my cursor. Can you see my cursor circling the 440?
Yep, we see the
okay.
cursor.
Good, okay. So so there's a lower house, the Pituflota, which is composed of 1 member elected per township. So there we have that number 330. And that's a first past the post system. And then we have an upper house, which is based on the states and regions as the main unit. Each state or region is equally represented regardless of the population, just like in the US Senate. What's different is that each state or region gets 12 members. And so there we have 14 states and regions times 12 members. That's 168 members in the upper house. So what's not familiar to what's very unusual about this system, of course, is that there is a supplementary number of members of parliament who are drawn from the military, who are appointed by the military, and amount to 1/4 of each house. So 110 in the lower house, 56 in the upper house. And the functions of the upper and lower house are not as distinct as they are in the United States or Canada. And very often the 2 parliaments sit together. And that's why we often hear this number of 664 seats in parliament. It's actually mixing upper and lower house, but it's quite common now to talk about 664 seats in parliament. And one of those things that the parliaments sit jointly quite a lot. And one of the things that they do is every 5 years they sit to elect the president. And we'll come to that in a sec. Meanwhile, on the same day as these upper and lower house elections are held, there are also elections that are held for each state and region for its own unicameral parliament. So quite different from Canada or Germany or many other federal states, where the subnational governments are elected like not at the same time as the national, and therefore you get a variety of elections throughout the year. Myanmar, just one big election, upper house, lower house, and all of the state and region parliaments. So we won't go into this, but it's a very strange system. It's a quasi parliamentary, quasi presidential system. And one of the important things that these two legislatures do as soon as they first sit is to elect the president. I won't go into it, but once the president is elected, the legislature has very little control over him or her after that point. So that's really one of the big prizes in the election is the electing enough members that you can elect the president. So we won't go back into election history, but I just wanted to point out that in 2010 we had a national set of elections that were held under not very free and fair conditions. The ruling Union Solidarity and Development Party won a crushing victory, as I said, under less than free and fair conditions. NLD boycotted that election. But I only bring this up to point out the difference between the 2010 election and the 2015 election. As you can see, in 2015, the NLD achieved a decisive victory with about 80% of all available seats in each of the upper and lower house. Again, that's available seats, not total seats, so it's only about 60% of the total seats. The ruling USDP was crushed. They only got about 8% of the available seats, despite a much higher proportional vote. Popular vote. That's of course the effect of first past the post. But I mean, on the surface, you can see that this is a relatively free and fair election if the opposition party can win such a huge victory. In 2015, we saw the NLD win about 90% of the seats in the Bamar heartland, but also do very well in places like Chin State, Kachin, Karen State. The two areas where they were relatively unsuccessful were in the west here, where the Arakan National Party swept most of the seats, and in the east in Shan State, where there's kind of a four-way fight between NLD, USDP, Shan National League for Democracy, and other small ethnic parties. So this election was quite well run and obviously fair to an extent. There were a number of underlying problems, such as the disenfranchisement of many ethnic groups, particularly the Rohingya and other so-called non-national races. Problems with military voting that was really not very well supervised. Problems with IDPs who were very often unable to vote, and also cancellations because of fighting. So again, that election did allow for expression of the will of the large majority of people. It had an almost 70% turnout, and so there was a relatively high bar set for this 2020 election. So we come to the 2020 election campaign. I know most of you know how this story ends, but I would just like to try to put yourself back a couple of years in 2018, let's say, when foreign pundits were trying to gin up excitement about how this was going to be a much more tightly fought campaign. That was the received wisdom, that it was an overwhelming victory for the NLD last time, but that was the enthusiasm of a first election. This time it would be more tightly fought. People were supposedly becoming dissatisfied with Aung San Suu Kyi. And in fact, we did see the founding of a number of national parties, that is non-based parties, founded by some fairly well-known political figures. This one here in the lower left by 88 generation hero Koko Ji. The PPP, People's Pioneer Party, was started by a defector, a high-profile defector from the NLD, Da Tet Tet Kine, with an aim to maybe make a more pro-business party, but we can talk about the failures of the ability of these parties to stake out ideological positions. And then, of course, there was also a party founded by ex-General Number 3 from the dictatorship, Tora Shweman, who was a defector from the USDP. So there were a number of parties that were founded with the aim of unseating or cutting into the NLD majority. So there was also the thought that maybe maybe Suu Kyi was popular with the Bamar, but ethnic parties would be much stronger competitors in this election. There was one of the reasons that was given for this is that ethnic parties in 2015 tended to fragment. There were 6 Chin parties, multiple parties of each ethnic group. And over the course of the last couple of years, many of these ethnic parties were able to coalesce into a united front, in particular in Mon State, Kaya, Kachin, and it was thought that probably this time around they'd be stronger competitors and maybe be able to sweep the ethnic seats, the seats in the states, which amount to almost 40% of the seats available. So we've set the stage for this 2020 election and we've identified the players, but of course the conditions for this election were not at all what we expected because along came COVID. Again, let me remind you, I've been in Myanmar throughout 2020, and let me remind you that back in March, April, it appeared that Myanmar had evaded the pandemic. And this lasted right through until August. Fatalities were in the single digits. Days went by without locally transmitted cases. The Myanmar government erred on the side of caution despite these low numbers, canceling, for example, the New Year's festivities in April, closing the iconic Shwedagon Pagoda, which is still closed, closing other religious facilities, tightly shutting borders, preventing parties and large gatherings. And here in Myanmar, we all felt quite fortunate up through May, June, July, August, as the rest of the world was racked by the pandemic. But our luck ran out at the end of August, and we began to have triple and then quadruple digit daily cases. And this happened at the very start of September, which was exactly the start of the 60-day active campaign period for the November 8th election. And by the middle of September, 1/5 of the country was locked down. All of Yangon region locked down, all of Rakhine, a number of other urban centers. Yangon is still locked down to this day. So this made for a very difficult environment for campaigning. In theory, COVID is probably a boon to established parties like the NLD and the USDP, who had their pre-existing networks, Facebook presence, and it made more difficult for new parties to raise their profile. Rallies were very difficult to hold. Door-to-door campaigning was outlawed in many places. But as you see from these photos, there was a certain amount of ingenuity in campaigning. My favorite is the old Myanmar standby here in the bottom right, the sound truck. That is trucks driving through neighborhoods, playing popular songs to celebrate a party or speeches. This was a common feature of the 2015 campaign, feature of this campaign. So the campaign was very muted, and there were some calls to postpone election day. But I think that was kind of complaining without any constructive alternative solution, because at the start of September, let's say, if we wanted to delay the election for 1 month or 6 weeks, is there any idea that would be held in a period where there's less coronavirus? There's no information whether it was getting better, getting worse, peaked or not. So that was just pure speculation. The idea of postponing it much longer became very problematic because according to the Constitution, the current parliament can only sit until the end of January. And so if the election had taken place after late January, we would have been plunged into a constitutional crisis. And remember, this is a very new democracy, and nobody had the desire to test the limits of the Constitution in only our democratic election. There was some criticism among some of the smaller parties, a lot of criticism among internationals that the NLD would not even entertain the possibility of delaying the election. This was kind of funny to me because it was almost at exactly the same time that there was an outcry about Donald Trump musing that maybe he would consider postponing the election. So the same people were criticizing Trump for considering postponing the election and criticizing Suu Kyi for not considering postponing the election. But that's the fun of being an international critic. The impact of COVID on the campaign was great, but not at all in the way it was laid out. I don't think we'll see from the results that the campaign, COVID or no, probably would not have had a significant difference. But what it did was the COVID pandemic really burnished Aung San Suu Kyi's already rising reputation. Her reputation was definitely on the ascendant since late 2019. And this March-August period where Myanmar was appearing to avoid the worst aspects of coronavirus was, further increased her popularity. And the NLD was very clever about this because this is a crisis that you might think would have been tailor-made for the military. The military are an organization that's adept at dealing with national emergencies like floods and so on. They have the ability to conduct massive nationwide logistics, but the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi completely shut them out in the sense that they got no photo ops. All of the coverage was about the Ministry of Health, about the doctors and nurses at the front line, and particularly about Aung San Suu Kyi, who even joined Facebook finally against her will to talk directly to the people about how to make your own mask, why you have to wear a mask, and so on. So COVID was very important in this campaign, I think. Now, speaking of, I mentioned Facebook, so let's talk about the other pandemics supposedly hanging over the election, and that was this pandemic of disinformation and hate speech that was supposedly brewing. This again was a very hot topic in 2018, 2019. Every INGO geared up its own anti-hate speech program. Again, there was some legitimate worry about this because very different environment 2015 and 2020. 2015, the internet was relatively new to Myanmar. By 2020, we have 37 million Facebook users. So the view was that Facebook was going to be used to incite violence, suppress voting. And in retrospect, it does not seem to have been a particularly significant problem. And why is that? I think part of it was a very, very energetic effort on behalf of Facebook in Myanmar. They were very sensitive about the criticisms they'd taken from 2015, or I should say more from the whole Rohingya crisis. And they had a very active team here hunting down and removing inflammatory or misleading content. The last time I remember looking at their statistics was they were taking down about 100,000 pieces a month in the middle of this year. This was all with the active participation of Myanmar NGOs and international INGOs working on tech and elections. And I think another thing we have to say is that we should give a little bit more credit to Myanmar citizens as sophisticated consumers of Facebook information. There was a lot of worry that they were going to be easily misled and riled up by Facebook, but it doesn't seem to have been a large problem. What was a big problem in the middle of October when we thought we were going to have a really boring election campaign were cancellations. There were cancellations in the 2015 election I mentioned. Most of them were in this area here in Shan State. There were 7 townships canceled and other parts canceled. In 2020, there were 15, and 15 that looked, in this case, a little bit suspicious. Very few people would deny that elections couldn't be held in these areas on the Shan-Chinese border, which are just not under government control. But this time, of course, 9 townships were completely canceled in Rakhine State. And very suspiciously, those were 7 ANP townships and 2 UNDP townships. So the election commission saw fit to cancel exactly 9 townships where the NLD had no sitting members of parliament. And this kind of highlighted the issue of the potential conflict of interest with the Union Election Commission. Now, so this does look very suspicious, but what does the data say? If we take a look at a map of, I haven't shown you Shan State, I'll just look at Rakhine. If you take a look at a map of Rakhine State, there were enormous numbers of armed conflict events over the past 3 to 6 months in the areas that were canceled. You may even remember that 3 NLD candidates were kidnapped in Rakhine State. So of course this put the election commission has the authority to make this decision, but they do it upon advice from the Ministry of Interior, that is to say, from the military. This puts the Union Election Commission in an extremely awkward situation where they are advised by the military to cancel. And put yourself in your position. What is your incentive to override that? If something goes wrong on election day, you are going to be left holding the bag for it. So like civil servants everywhere, I think they err on the side of reducing catastrophic downside, and that's what they did in this situation. The one thing I'll just draw your attention to is there's a difference between whole cancellations and partial cancellations. In whole cancellations, the entire township election is not really canceled, but postponed. There is no election held, no MP is returned, and in theory, a year later or 18 months later, you can hold a by-election. This has happened in the last electoral cycle. Partial cancellations are actually more problematic in a way because a member of parliament is returned, but the people from those parts of that township that are canceled don't get a voice. And that opens the door to gerrymandering and is very problematic. We'll see though in a second who won these possibly gerrymandered seats. So election day. Oops. Just 1 second before we talk about election day, I would just like you to notice that I haven't said anything about election issues. Let's talk about that in the question period, and maybe I would ask you to think between now and then, what do you think were the top election issues? We have data on this. You know, there were survey data that asked people in the states and regions, what were the issues that were most important to them during this election? So let's talk about that in a sec. So election day, what was election day like? I was an observer in 2015 election day, and I was an observer in 2020 election day. It was very difficult because of travel restrictions. 2015, I was able to travel to the Delta, to multiple cities. Here, I had to stay within Yangon region, although my observer card gave me the right to move across township lines, which is not a right that the average citizen has here. You have to stay in your own part of the city, but we were able to travel around the city. The Asia Foundation had a relatively small team. We covered 3 states and regions, 15 townships out of 330, and about 150 polls. So, what was the atmosphere like on election day? Well, in 2015, the day started off with a great deal of trepidation and anxiety. People were worried about stolen election. Was there going to be a coup and so on? And over the course of the day, the atmosphere became more and more festive. I'd say it was a little bit different here. The atmosphere was, there was a little bit of nervousness about COVID. And there wasn't that same kind of festive feeling, but there was, from the people I talked to, a real sense of there was no choice in the matter. You couldn't, you had to do your civic duty, COVID or no. And we'll see in a second that the turnout kind of validates that anecdotal evidence. So large lines started forming at dawn. Polls in Myanmar open at 6 o'clock. People like to vote early to avoid the heat of the day. Let me just show you a few photographs. There were quite good sanitary measures in force at all the polling stations. You had to wear a mask to get into the polling station. Sometimes if your mask didn't look up to scratch, you'd be given a new one, or a mask and a visor. There was temperatures taken at the entrance. People were encouraged to use hand sanitizer. The thing that was not possible was social distancing. Social distancing in a situation where you had 25 million people voting over the space of 8 hours was just not possible. And the country is kind of bracing for a possible post-election coronavirus spike. We haven't seen it yet. I'm not sure if any of you had the pleasure of being here during an election, but very well-run event. Most polls are in schools or religious buildings. Just again, the iconic pinky photo. People show their pinky after they vote. This is our election observation. You can see in the background the degree to which social distancing was possible. Not very much. So, what were the results? Here's the 2020 map, and if you cast your mind back to the 2015 map, looks pretty much the same. You can see again in the Bamar heartland, complete and utter victory of the NLD. Again, the NLD manages to dominate many of the states and regions. Sorry, the states. But again, although these gray townships are postponed, the NLD again is defeated in Rakhine State, and again there's this kind of four-way split in Shan State. The NLD did, you know, in 2015 they won 90% of the seats in the Bamar heartland. This time they won 98% of those seats. The USDP was completely routed from their last strongholds in the Bamar areas, only managing to hang on in some peripheral areas, particularly where there were split votes between NLD and ethnic parties, where there were large military populations. The new national parties won 0 seats, so that's in the nationwide. In the ethnic states, or in the ethnic majority states, the NLD also won a majority of seats, sweeping almost Chin, Kachin, Kayin State, doing very well in Kaya and Mon, but not as well as in 2015, and that's because I think of the ability of the Kaya and Mon parties to unify, and then again, as I pointed out in Shan, kind of a four-way fight. So if we take a look at I don't know if you can see the numbers here, they're a little bit small, but if you take a look in 2015, NLD won 255 seats in the lower house, this time 258, and 135 last time in the upper house, this time 138. Almost exactly the same result. They picked up about half a dozen seats. The USDP lost about half a dozen seats, and the ethnic parties won about the same number, minus the extra number of cancellations that we see this time. So I think once those seats in Rakhine State are ever rerun, we'll see a parliament that is very, very similar to the last time, with the only exception that NLD did a little better among Burmese, a little worse among ethnic groups, and the USDP did worse in both situations. So that's the national parliaments, but as advertised, there were also state and region elections. I hope you can see this. I hope it's not too small for you. Here are the 14. Edgar, can you see it clearly now?
Yeah, they're clear.
So, sorry, it's a little bit small, but here are the 14. Oh, sorry. Let me just stop for one sec. I should explicitly say the NLD has its supermajority again. Remember, we only needed 333. Last time they got 390. This time they got 396. Okay, so here are the state and region parliaments. If you take a look, it's almost the same results, and that's not so surprising since these votes are held on exactly the same day. You don't get the, you know, in Canada, you very often get provincial elections can be kind of a midterm review of the national government and a protest vote and so on. But here the votes really line up. Same thing you see in the 7 regions. The NLD won almost every single seat in the 7 regions. They're completely dominant in Kachin, Chin, and Mon State. Kaya, they don't have a majority because this diagram doesn't show the additional military seats. So it is possible for their legislation to be blocked by a military USDP or military USDP Kaya coalition. And in Rakhine State, you can see they did not do well, despite any claims of gerrymandering. In Shan State, again, you have this wild 4-way split, actually a 5-way split because you also have the military. So there's going to have to be a lot of deal making in the Shan Parliament. Of course, the chief ministers.
Sorry, as you are on that slide, there's a question that is coming in for quick clarification in terms of the performance of the merged ethnic parties.
The which, sorry, the which ethnic parties?
For the ethnic parties that were merged?
Yes.
Can you
yes.
highlight
Okay.
that performance?
Yes. So it's very clear here. The Mon in Mon State and Kaya State. So you see, in Mon State and Kaya are kind of middle cases. The ethnic parties did do okay. Not, you know, they didn't beat the NLD, but they didn't do as poorly as in Chin or Cayenne, for example. Mon and Kaya were two examples of where the parties were able to merge. Kachin was also a merged party, and I haven't seen the detailed data yet, but I think the reason why the Kachin ethnic parties were not able to do as well is that Kachin is much more ethnically diverse. The Kachin are a smaller percentage of Kachin state than the Cayenne of Cayenne state or the Mon of Mon state, and there are a number of ethnic minority groups in Kachin state that are sizable. Shan, for example, or Rawang, there are many. So this is some evidence that at least in these two cases, Kaya and Mon, the merged parties did well. Of course, Rakhine is the gold standard. Rakhine, the Rakhine National Party does very well, even though there was a small splinter. And in Shan state, actually, there is only one dominant Shan party, the SNLD. It wasn't a merger. The other ones are just kind of withered. But again, Shan, like Kachin, is not overwhelmingly ethnic Shan. Shan are only the largest, not the dominant ethnic group in the state. So in all 14 of these cases, though, the NLD has the power to name the chief minister. I just wanted to mention something about, this is a good spot to mention female participation. The number of female members of parliament at the national level is about 16%, slightly higher in the lower house than the upper house. And in the state and region this time, it's about 18%. And 18% may not sound like a lot, but in 2010, it was 4%. In 2015, it was 13%. And in 2020, it was 18%. And that 18% covers up some very big, very wide gap. In Yangon, it's actually 30%, whereas in Chin State, it's about 6%. So there tend to be more women in the Bamar regions than in the ethnic minority regions. Not sure, that could be a statistical fluke, but that's the result. So those are the results. Let's talk a bit about what happened after that. So this is a familiar site for those of you who followed the American election. After the results started to come in quantity, and it was quite obvious that the NLD had won another crushing victory, and that the USDP had done even worse than before. The USDP made a public statement that they considered the results of the election invalid and that there should be a new election run. Not very good reasons given for it, but nonetheless, they demanded this. Now, I think this is a very interesting case, because what was the response of the Myanmar people to this? Was it panic? Was it a thought like, oh no, we were a military dictatorship 10 years ago. We've seen coup after the 1990 election. We've seen military crackdowns within very recent memory. Is this the end? The military-backed party has said they don't accept the results of the election. And for those of you who are here, you'll know that there seemed to be like zero worry about it among Myanmar people. The word on Facebook was, oh my God, the USDP are such pathetic losers. Why don't they just suck it up? And sure enough, this protest is withered. Even the military has said they don't really want, any part of it. So I just want to underline how remarkable this is, that there was no kind of sense of panic or frenzy. And I think it's an illustration of how far Myanmar has come in such a very short time. And again, I'd like to remind everyone that for all the imperfections of Myanmar's democracy, every day that goes by, every election that goes by, democracy becomes more firmly entrenched here. And there's very little risk, I think, in the minds of Myanmar people that there's going to be any kind of coup, return to military rule, return to some kind of quasi-military rule under the USDP. So I think we really do forget the kind of headwinds that the democracy here has to deal with on a daily basis. It's very, very, not very far removed from dictatorship. So let me just wind up with a couple of comments about the election in general. There were a lot of problems in the 2020 campaign. We can talk about this during the question period, but let me just frame them in two bunches. One bunch is structural problems that have to do with the Constitution. That is to say, 25% military seats, the lack of independence of the Union Election Commission, which is unfortunately specified in the Constitution. It's going to be very difficult to change it, but it's since it appears to benefit the NLD, perhaps the military would be willing to make that kind of constitutional change. And then, of course, the issue of disenfranchisement of citizens. This is it's a hugely important issue, most obviously with the Rohingya, but it's much broader than the election because it rests on the legal specification of who's a citizen and who's not. Then there were during the election there were smaller issues that were, let's say, government malfeasance. You might have read about some of them, some kind of petty harassment of government critics, the No Vote campaign, denying or restricting access to free campaign media. These kinds of things were of very marginal importance, but they're worrying in the sense that they're symptoms of the overuse of laws against political opposition. And this is going to become very tempting for a party with such an incredible mandate and that's been in power, it looks like it's going to be in power for quite a while. So that's a worrying sign. I want to mention three good things that happened this election. One, there was tremendous progress made on supervising military voting. It was very difficult for the military to vote unsupervised in their barracks this time. The UEC was able to, I guess not force them, but to gain their agreement to vote in UEC supervised public polling stations. Another one was IDPs. The residency requirement for voting was squeezed from 180 days to 90 days. And this, in theory, made it easier for IDPs to vote in their places of temporary residence. It used to be quite difficult. Thirdly was efforts at transparency on the part of the UEC. This was very much a work in progress. You know, they've got this form of it, having press conferences and so on, but there's a lot of continuity from the military government to the quasi-military government to today's government in terms of lack of interest in transparency. And a greater deal of transparency would have assuaged a lot of the concerns about cancellations and postponements. Just one other thing that I want to say, we've mentioned the greater number of female parliamentarians, but also there was a tiny breakthrough in that the NLD nominated 2 Muslim candidates, both of whom won their elections. And although the numbers are not large, it was very interesting that the negative campaigning against them or other negative campaigning mostly by the USDP fell completely flat. The USDP was the only party that relied to any extent on this, and you saw it did them absolutely no good. So let's again give credit to Myanmar voters for the good sense to make decisions based on issues other than that.
Okay.
So the last thing I thought I'll leave with you is that the NLD has this enormous, overwhelming mandate, and there is a worry that they could use it to run roughshod over opposition, but they are making the right day after sounds anyway, reaching out to ethnic parties saying that they would like to work collectively for the national good. Of course, they're going to need this kind of support if they want to change the constitution and to have more placid relations at the state and region level. But I think it's a very good first olive branch. So, sorry, I've gone over time. Let me hand it back.